You're incredibly courageous. I wish my commanders were as fearless as you. You all shaped history, and you're the true legend. Rahus Misch stood nearer to Adolf Hitler than almost anyone, watching, hearing, protecting. As his bodyguard and telephonist, Misch observed the dictator, not just as a leader, but as a human, unpredictable, charming, brutal, and sometimes disturbingly normal. I was merely a young trooper, Hitler's guard, not a statesman. I saw everything firsthand. Now, his story peels away the layers of myth and deception to reveal a Hitler the world hasn't really seen. The last person to witness Adolf Hitler's final moments has now passed. From hushed conversations in the Reich Chancellery to quiet times in the bunker, Misch's revelations are shocking. This isn't simply a glimpse at the monster of history. It's a haunting profile of the man beneath the chaos. Music joining the Führer's service Rohus. Misch's journey into the inner realm of Adolf Hitler's regime was shaped less by belief than by fate. Born in 1917 in what was then Silesia, Misch lost both his guardians early on and was raised by his grandparents. Like many young men in Germany during the 1930s, he got caught up in the wave of nationalism and joined the SS, the military arm of the Nazi Party, in 1937. At first, it was a move fueled more by a need for stability and inclusion than by firm political belief. The SS for young enlistees like Misch promised a secure path, steady wages, and a sense of purpose at a time when Germany was still suffering from the financial crash of the Weimar Republic and the bitterness following World War I. His fate shifted swiftly. In 1938, Misch was chosen to enter the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, an elite group originally designed to act as Hitler's personal bodyguard. This wasn't any typical post. The Leibstandarte operated at the peak of Nazi control and consisted only of men deemed completely loyal to the Führer. Acceptance demanded intense physical training, absolute obedience, an unwavering loyalty to the Nazi cause, or at least the ability to convincingly show those qualities. The unit followed Hitler during public outings, shielded him in private meetings, and maintained a nearly constant watch around the upper leadership of the Third Reich. By 1940, at only 23 years old, Misch had been drawn into the inner layer of Hitler's personal guard, a position that placed him close to one of history's most notorious figures. He eventually became one of the few individuals allowed to move freely within the Führer's multiple command centers, as Hitler's guard, messenger, and finally his communications officer. Misch wasn't just a spectator to the regime's last days. He was rooted deep within its most guarded space. That level of closeness to Hitler would shape Misch's entire journey, and ultimately, his memory. Day to day inside Hitler's orbit, Rohus Misch wasn't your average personal protector. He operated at the core of the Nazi government, placed in the private quarters and secure bunkers where key choices of World War II were finalized. His tasks went well beyond watching doors. Misch was in charge of maintaining Hitler's private phone systems, securing communication lines, passing urgent military updates, and handling encrypted radio and telegraph devices. His job gave him rare access to some of the most classified and critical parts of the Nazi war engine, from 1940 through the fall of the Third Reich in 1945. Misch was around at nearly every one of Hitler's command locations. He worked at the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, the Berghof, in the Bavarian Alps, and most notably, the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, Hitler's primary Eastern Front command base. It was there, in July 1944, that he barely survived the unsuccessful assassination plot by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, one of the most well-known attempts against Hitler. Misch saw the chaos that followed the blast and the tightening of Hitler's trusted circle in its wake. Despite the violent and widespread aftermath of the regime he served, Misch claimed after the war that he had no idea of the crimes being committed across Nazi-controlled Europe. He said, "He was merely a faithful soldier obeying commands, unaware of the Holocaust or the detailed workings of Nazi extermination plans. Still, his closeness to authority raised serious suspicion about those statements. Misch was often the first link for incoming messages from the battlefront and sat just beyond doors where top-level planning sessions occurred. Sessions attended by figures like Heinrich Himmler, Joseph Goebbels, Hermann Göring, and Albert Speer. He watched these men arrive and depart, sometimes in panic, sometimes with cold calm as the course of war began shifting against Germany. And as Germany plunged into collapse, that role of quiet observer became much more risky and complex. Inside the bunker, during Hitler's final hours, in April 1945, the once powerful Nazi leadership was on the edge of complete ruin. Berlin, the heart of Hitler's control, was being crushed from every direction as Soviet troops advanced steadily through the city's outer zones. The fight in Europe was nearly over, and the German army was in full withdrawal. Amid the wreckage and devastation, Adolf Hitler chose to vanish from public life and seek cover deep below the Reich Chancellery in the Führerbunker, a strongly reinforced underground shelter built to operate as both a hideout and war HQ during dire emergencies. Among those who joined Hitler in this final stronghold was Rohus Misch, when the command came to shift everything below ground. Misch obeyed, not realizing he was stepping into what would go down as one of the most infamously recorded death scenes in recent history. Once locked inside the bunker, conditions quickly became bleak. The mood was tense, suffocating, and increasingly suspicious. Hitler, now a shadow of the man who once led armies across Europe, spent his last days giving erratic commands and fixating on supposed betrayals. He refused to accept the full reality of Germany's downfall, instead convincing himself that betrayal from within, not Allied strength, was the cause of the defeat. Rohus Misch stayed at his station through this mental unraveling, handling the bunker's vital communication lines. But as Soviet shells roared louder by the minute, and updates from outside grew more grim, even simple jobs started to feel unreal. The war beyond was ending in smoke and debris, but inside the bunker, the Nazi leadership clung to fantasies of power, even as their empire crumbled around them. By late April, most of the capital's fighters were either gone, surrendered, or fleeing. Berlin had turned into a last stand, and the bunker itself was now more tomb than shelter. Inside, Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda chief, stayed fiercely devoted. So did Martin Bormann, Hitler's personal assistant. Not once did Misch consider deserting the Führer, but even their loyalty couldn't hide the obvious. The Third Reich was done. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun died by suicide inside the Führerbunker, the sealed bunker where Adolf Hitler took his own life. On April 30, 1945, Eva took poison. Hitler, according to most versions, shot himself in the head. Rohus Misch was just a few doors away when it happened. Shortly after, Misch saw the bodies wrapped in covers and carried past him up the steps to the garden of the Chancellery. There, in line with Hitler's clear orders, the corpses were laid in a shallow blast crater, soaked in gasoline, and set on fire. The idea was to stop the Soviet army from retrieving the remains and turning them into a grotesque war trophy. Misch stayed underground for another 3 days after Hitler's death. By then, the bunker was hauntingly silent, filled with a mixture of fear, hopelessness, and surrender. Food was limited, ammunition was dwindling, and above all, they knew the Soviets were closing in. Finally, with no choices left and Soviet troops nearing the bunker's outer edge, Rohus Misch chose to run. But his capture by Soviet hands wasn't the end of the story. It was the start of nearly a decade in detention and a lifetime of silence, 9 years of questioning and isolation. After leaving the safety of the bunker, where he'd spent the last moments of the Third Reich, Rohus Misch was swiftly taken by approaching Soviet forces. Given his role as Adolf Hitler's personal guard and telephone assistant, Misch was seen as a captive of high value. Soviet military officials viewed him as someone with direct knowledge of Hitler's actions, tight circle, and maybe even secret war plans. Because of this, Misch was put through constant interrogation. For the next 9 years, he was passed between multiple Soviet labor camps and maximum security prisons. The conditions were cruel: freezing winters, grueling work, scarce food, and barely any connection with the outside world. Interrogations were regular and draining. Soviet commanders wanted to know everything: Hitler's mental state in the final weeks of the war, the bunker's schedule, the choices and words of other top Nazi members, and any classified facts that may have stayed buried as the Reich crumbled. Misch told what he could, but often claimed to know nothing beyond what was directly around him. In 1954, almost a decade after being detained, Misch was suddenly freed. He returned to a changed West Berlin, a city now divided by Cold War tensions. Despite the political chaos and the deep scars of his imprisonment, Misch quietly returned to civilian life. He opened a small store and chose to settle in the same district where he had once been raised, as if trying to reclaim a fragment of the life he'd known before the war. For many years, he stayed away from attention. Unlike some former Nazis who either faced trials or vanished into exile, Misch remained. He kept things private, avoided the media, and rarely shared details about what he had witnessed or gone through during the war. Some believed he avoided charges simply because he held no official rank or made no big decisions. Others felt it was because he had kept quiet, offering very little during questioning and staying silent long after. Over time, Misch became a bit of a mystery. A man who had stood next to one of history's most notorious tyrants, yet somehow faded into the background. His story for a long while stayed mostly unspoken, but what he did say was just as powerful as what he chose to leave out. The man who wouldn't betray the boss. In the early 2000s, Rohus Misch suddenly stepped back into the limelight as the final surviving member of Adolf Hitler's closest circle. Misch started giving interviews, featuring in documentaries, and later released a memoir called The Last Witness. The final witness to Adolf Hitler's closing hours had himself passed. To many, his return was a chance to hear directly what it had been like inside Hitler's bunker during the last days of the Third Reich. But what really surprised people wasn't just what he recalled, it was the way he decided to describe it. Instead of showing remorse or admitting any feeling of shame, Misch spoke of his years with Hitler in oddly fond, even sentimental tones. He insisted he had merely been doing his duty. Nothing more, nothing else. In a 2005 chat with the Associated Press, Misch was asked the obvious question: had Hitler ever talked about the Holocaust? His reply was short and disturbing. That was never discussed. Ever. He didn't try to deny the reality of the Holocaust, but he removed himself from it completely, claiming he'd never heard Hitler mention it. 4 years later, in a 2009 talk with the BBC, Misch added a bit more. He admitted knowing that labor camps existed. He even named Dachau, the first Nazi concentration camp created in 1933. But again, he insisted he had no real grasp of the size or horror of what was taking place inside them. According to him, I knew about Dachau camp and about concentration camps overall, but I had no clue about the scope. It wasn't part of our talks. When asked whether he carried any remorse for having worked so closely with Hitler, both as a guard and as part of his personal communications team, Misch gave a reply that shocked many. He was a great boss. I stayed with him for 5 years. We were the nearest people who worked around him. We were always present. Hitler was never without us, day or night. This firm loyalty wasn't just something Misch said in brief interviews. It was the foundation of his memoir, The Last Witness. All through the book, he described himself as a faithful worker who just followed instructions and stayed out of politics. He shared behind-the-scenes looks into Hitler's daily life. but consistently dodged the bigger moral questions tied to the Nazi rule. He never accepted blame. He never wondered if being that close to authority carried a duty. Instead, he portrayed those years spent in Hitler's circle as some kind of strange office position. In the foreword to the English translation, he even wrote that it had all been a different world and that his time there felt like a normal day at the job. To some, especially in Germany and parts of Eastern Europe, Misch was seen as a symbol of a troubling past. He was remembered as a man who had seen unspeakable history, but chose to ignore it. His supporters, though, saw him as a soldier caught by fate, a young guy drawn into events way beyond his reach, who had simply obeyed orders and made it out alive. But critics believed that this excuse was not just weak, it was harmful. They accused Misch of hiding behind his loyalty to Hitler as a way to dodge owning up to his part, however small, in a criminal regime, by painting Hitler as a great boss and describing himself as neutral. Misch seemed to avoid the deeper moral accounting that many others had faced after the war. And then, not long after those interviews and the release of his book, the unavoidable happened. The end of a devoted soldier. Rohus Misch died on September 5, 2013, at the age of 96. His passing represented more than the loss of one individual. It marked the end of a direct living link to one of the darkest and most notorious episodes in modern world history. When Misch died, there were no emotional final words shared with the public. There was no confession of shame, no heartfelt expression of remorse, and no clear effort at finding redemption for his role in the Nazi system. In death, just like in life, Misch kept a stance of firm loyalty and silence about the regime he had once served so closely. For many historians, scholars, and analysts of World War II and Holocaust history, Misch's death symbolized a closing chapter, a final, permanent break from a first-hand observer to events that shaped the 20th century in the most devastating of ways. With no public confession or personal revelations, Misch was widely viewed as a man who had taken his memories, his experiences, and maybe his real beliefs with him to the grave. That idea held strong for over a decade, until a letter unexpectedly came to light, and it has left the world shocked. The letter that changed everything. In early 2025, construction workers doing routine repairs in a long-abandoned apartment made a discovery that sent shockwaves through the historical world. The apartment had supposedly once been rented by Rohus Misch. As workers pulled away part of the insulation inside one of the walls, they uncovered a hidden metal box, airtight and tightly sealed. The container appeared untouched for decades. Inside, they discovered a folded, yellowed envelope, worn by age, but completely intact. It was handwritten in German and dated late 2012, just a few months before Misch's death. The letter was signed in full, Rohus Misch. Its opening line was short and unsettling. "I can't stay silent anymore." A document that went against everything Misch had said publicly for years. The letter described events he had seen while working in Hitler's inner circle. Many of them, he said, had haunted him for years. Misch confessed that he had lied to protect himself. In public, he had always claimed he knew nothing of the regime's worst actions. But in private, as shown in this final letter, the truth was far more disturbing. He wrote about political prisoners and suspected traitors being buried alive, often in isolated wooded areas. He said the executions were done without mercy or trial. According to the letter, Hitler himself occasionally watched the killings from behind reinforced glass. Misch remembered one incident in terrifying detail: victims clawing at the earth, screaming as Hitler watched calmly. He smiled and said, "Justice sleeps best underground." Misch also wrote about poison trials on prisoners done at Hitler's command. He stated that Hitler not only observed the testing, but made notes and demanded timed recordings. The experiments were repeated with various changes, while the victims were left to suffer. Misch wrote that he was nearby for some of those trials, though he claimed he never took part directly. The most horrifying section of the letter involved the death of a young girl, reportedly given to Hitler by a top officer as a gesture of loyalty and admiration. A few days later, the girl was discovered dead in the woods near the Berghof Hitler's mountain hideout. The official record at the time labeled it an enemy attack, but Misch wrote that he always suspected Hitler had ordered her killing, maybe to erase a possible liability. He said the situation was carefully buried in internal SS documents. Throughout the letter, Misch came back to the emotional toll these memories had taken on him. He wrote about being haunted by visions, unable to rest for nights at a stretch. "I see their faces in the dark," he wrote. "I hear their cries under the ground." Misch said he had carried this burden for years, locked up in silence. He had convinced himself he was merely a guard, a witness, but as he got older, the memories grew heavier and tougher to carry. The letter shows he could no longer justify the things he had seen with the version of himself he tried to show the world. He closed the letter with a harsh confession. "I lied to protect myself, but silence is another form of guilt. Let the truth finally be known, even if it arrives too late." Experts who studied the container and the letter believe it was intentionally hidden in a way that would ensure it stayed untouched until long after Misch's passing. The method of sealing airtight container, insulation, and precise concealments suggests that Misch wanted the truth revealed, but only when he was no longer around to face it. What started as a letter in a wall has now turned into a moral shockwave, one that's triggered a fresh look at the final living witness to Hitler's rule. The world is still wrestling with Misch's last words, although no official comment has yet been made about what the letter holds. Multiple sources familiar with its review have confirmed that serious discussions are now underway at both federal and state historical institutions. These meetings reportedly focus on three major things: verifying the letter, properly translating its contents, and deciding whether or not to make it public. The process is expected to be slow and highly monitored. Meanwhile, survivors of the Nazi era and Holocaust education leaders have quietly pushed for full openness. They say the letter, if confirmed, could offer vital new insight into Adolf Hitler's mindset and the inner structure of the Third Reich's leadership. According to a few experts, the claims inside the letter might even lead to the uncovering of long-lost files or unknown figures who may have seen important events. Not everyone sees eye to eye on how to move forward. Some historians and researchers have reportedly urged patience, warning that rushing ahead without full proof could do more damage than good. At the same time, a small but outspoken group of skeptics has raised concerns about the way the letter was found. They doubt the intentions of the workers who reportedly discovered the document, suggesting they might be chasing fame or profit. However, the head of the crew has rejected these claims, saying the team gave the letter straight to officials and never wanted media exposure. Despite these claims, doubt continues to hover in certain circles. Amid this growing debate, several independent contacts with ties to the inquiry have quietly said the letter is almost certainly genuine. One insider who has reportedly reviewed important parts of the letter said it lines up too perfectly with details. Misch could not have known unless he was present and unless he was truly paying attention. For now, the public remains electrified, shocked by the letter that has slowly started appearing online. Many are anxiously awaiting the full publication of the letter, which is expected too. The man who spent his years avoiding responsibility, defending Hitler, and insisting on ignorance of the horrors around him, may have saved the most chilling truths for a moment when he could no longer be blamed, and by doing so, Raucus Misch may have finally confessed in death the guilt he could never accept in life. What do you think about Misch's confession? Feel free to leave your thoughts with us in the comments section. Thanks for watching.